Welcome back to the Side Chat Podcast. This week we will be discussing everything having to do with the 109. Bismarck is here.
Hello.
This will be a two-part series. This week we will do basically early production models through the F model in North Africa, and then in a couple weeks or so we're going to hit up the G and Ks for the part 2. So initially we're going to talk about 1934 and a little bit before that, where basically if you never took high school history, Germany after World War One was not allowed to produce anything having to do with military weapons or vehicles or anything like that. So
Indeed.
basically, we want to talk about how the Germans got away with a little bit of
Sneaky.
yeah, very
Or
sneaky.
being sneaky. Yes.
Germans at that point in history had the most scientists, engineers, and basically highly educated people in the world all lived there. And the way they still got their designs out and stuff was to build basically high performance mail planes, airliners, cargo planes, and so on. You want to talk about the first, I guess it was like about 1934, the initial contract that was put out for the first fighter?
Yeah. So basically, what happened even before the Nazis took power, the German military looked into, of course, rearming themselves. One common misconception is that everything started after Hitler took power, but quite a few projects actually started before that, and there were clear plans before that. Trying to find loopholes in the Versailles Treaty and trying to find some way to rearm oneself by any means necessary, because obviously, Germany also wants to be secure in where it's located, with France next to it, Russia on the other side, and so forth. So ways were found to basically get new weapons and get the army back into some shape or form. Of course, it only really took off after 1933, and roughly in beginning of July 1933, the first kind of requirements were set out for the few parts of the new Luftwaffe that was going to be set up, which were required, for example, twin engine bombers, transport vehicles, and of course fighters. And one of those was the Rüstungsflugzeug 4, which essentially means a military aircraft number 4. And the requirements for this one were set out, as I said, in early July 1933. It called for a single-seat fighter. The speed should be 400 kilometers per hour at 6 kilometers of altitude. It should be able to go at full power at 6 kilometers of altitude for at least 20 minutes, and to achieve this full power at will. So whenever the pilot needed it, there shouldn't be any kind of downgrade in kind of materials for the engine and so on. So it should always kind of reach that full power for at least 20 minutes. Flight duration should be 1.5 hours at 6 kilometers of altitude, full power. Climb to 6 kilometers should be maximum 17 minutes. The ceiling of the aircraft should be 10 kilometers. Takeoff runway was set to 400 meters. Weaponry here, it gets a little bit sketchy. There's a couple of sources that say one thing and the other sources say, once again, something else. It was either 2 machine guns with 1,000 rounds or one 20mm cannon with 100 rounds. However, I've also seen sources that said it should be 3 machine guns. So a little bit of, well, we probably don't really know what was for sure. The source that I have that copies essentially, the full list of requirements says 2 machine guns, but I've so many times I read that it's supposed to be 3 machine guns, so it might have been that as well. There was supposed to be some kind of modern equipment in the aircraft as well, like seat belts, parachute, oxygen system.
Radios were one of those too.
Yes, heating, self-healing, seating fuel tank, and radio. Also, the aircraft was supposed to be easy to fly by instruments, and one important thing was also that it should be easily transported by rail. So essentially, the Germans said it should fit into a normal, carriage, a rail carriage with the wings detached. I don't know what normal means, but the Germans always had their specifications. Also, what was deemed to be a plus is if it has a good field of view for aerial engagements, that the weapons are installed to ease operation in the sky and service on the ground. It should be flyable by pilots of average skill, and spin recovery should be easy, and the priorities were speed over climb over maneuverability.
And that contract was put out to companies like Heinkel. Heinkel was actually one of the powerhouses back then.
Heinkel was pretty much, one of the companies that was known throughout Germany for their aircrafts. The Heinkel 51, as everybody knows, who's played Warfare, that's the reserve aircraft that was also in the Luftwaffe. So they already had their feet in the door, essentially, or one foot in the door. We also have Arado. Everybody knows Arado. They also tried to get into this contract, and of course, Bayerische Flugwerke, which would be Messerschmitt. Those three companies got this kind of specification contract in 1934. And then later on, they actually got it in February, and in September of that year, Focke-Wulf got it. And nobody knows exactly why this delay was in place. Focke-Wulf wasn't essentially, a hated figure or company in Germany, but they simply didn't get the specifications until like 7 months later. And the design they put out, which was the Focke-Wulf 159 V1, was a little bit outdated. Kind of had a top wing design, a rather complicated deployable landing gear, enclosed cockpit, which was a plus, of course. The UMO 210 was inside it already, which was also a plus. But production essentially ceased, or even the prototype production ceased after 3 of them were built, and they never made the cut. They were probably the weakest contender in that contest, which I guess is natural if you only have a couple of months to prepare. Then we have Arado 80 V1, open cockpit, which was a big negative. Fixed landing gear, once again a big negative. Actually, the landing gear looks very similar to the later Junkers 87s, and it was powered by a Rolls-Royce Kestrel 2S, which roughly gave 600 horsepower. The Germans actually had to rely on British engines a lot by this time, because their Jumo engine and their Daimler-Benz engines were just being, trialed and then later put into production. So a lot of the early planes that the Germans were building as prototypes were actually powered by Rolls-Royce engines. And then we move on, I guess, to the Heinkel 112 and the Bf 109. The Bf 109 V1, which was supposed to be shown for this comparison flight trials, actually crashed in September 1935 before this trial. It was repaired, but pretty much not used in the trials itself. However, this original Bf 109 existed until 1938. The code name, if anybody's interested, is IABI. It's kind of that's where it all started, from that V1, which unfortunately crashed on landing. It was also powered by the Rolls-Royce engine. The V2, actually, this was a kind of a blessing for Messerschmitt, because it crashed, they were able to build the V2, and that one already had the Jumo 210A, which essentially had 680 horsepower, which did way better than the Kestrel, and that one was also already ready to have weapons installed into it. So when we then look at Heinkel, which came with their V1 to the competition, which in itself was, a sound aerodynamic design. It also had a deployable landing gear, but it was powered by that Rolls-Royce engine. That Rolls-Royce engine was roughly 100 horsepower weaker than the Jumo 210A. And that's where you can start to see that the Bf 109 starts outperforming this Heinkel 112, which was initially said to be the favorite among the competition.
It's HE 112. There's 2 kind of stories I've always heard. One is that Messerschmitt got the contract over Heinkel because Messerschmitt was kind of in the Nazi party and was a favorite to Hitler. And then Heinkel, of course, kind of was on the outside, but in real terms, the 109 was a much better aircraft over the HE 112. In actual trials, the 109 did better in a lot of categories.
Yes.
The HE 112 did stay in production, though, for quite a while, and I think it was more exported to other countries than it was used in Germany.
Yeah, the Heinkel was, even though the V2, the Bf 109 V2 beat the Heinkel 112 V1, Heinkel was encouraged to continue developing his aircraft, which was something that wasn't, given, kind of a little bit of throwing him a bone, basically. which wasn't given to Arado and Focke-Wulf. Those guys were immediately told, your designs essentially suck. We can't use these things. Heinkel, of course, we already know a couple of other planes that were in service by that point. The Heinkel 51, I already talked about that one. Also, the Heinkel 111s later became the kind of standard run-of-the-mill German bombers. So Heinkel was encouraged to keep developing his aircraft. However, as you said, Bo, the actual performance values between the 109 and the Heinkel 112, they were there. And even when the Heinkel 112 was finally fitted with the Jumo 210 engine, it simply didn't have the performance of the Bf 109. It's not just the aircraft that made an impression. Messerschmitt kind of made an impression as well. Initially, he faced a lot of opposition in the aviation ministry of Germany. His company nearly went bankrupt earlier. In fact, it had already filed for bankruptcy. And the minister of the aviation, the ministry, he was the same guy as the director in charge of Lufthansa. And Lufthansa had initially ordered a plane from Messerschmitt. That plane, the prototype crashed, and they cancelled the contract, even though the production was already up and running. And of course, that was a big monetary loss for Messerschmitt and Messerschmitt himself, and Eberhard Milch, which was this minister. They didn't like each other. They were barely on talking terms at this point. So it wasn't easy. However, with kind of a little bit of lobbying here and there, with kind of taking influence on the kind of whole ministry and having kind of a few dinners maybe with these guys, Messerschmitt was kind of able to get himself into that ministry and force himself upon them and have his creation essentially shown around more so than Heinkel could.
Let's real quickly go back and talk about the Bf 108 before we move any further.
Yes.
Messerschmitt created an aircraft called the Bf 108. It's not a fighter in any terms if you've never seen it. It's like a 4-person kind of personal aircraft.
It looks a little bit like a modern Tampico.
But this thing had a lot of technology that was ahead of its time, and then that technology was kind of transplanted into 109. The construction method of using basically all metal construction. You had the leading edge slats, I believe, were on both of those. Well, anyway.
It's possible, yeah. Yeah, they were, yes.
Leading edge slats, and just kind of that type of technology was put from the 108 into the 109, which kind of made the 109. The 108 went out of production, I believe, around that time the 109 started. And then France actually started producing them a bit after the war for export as a personal plane. So you still see some 108s flying around today. Most of those, I believe, are the post-war French ones. But it's kind of an important aircraft. I know a lot of people actually, pilots talk very highly of the 108, even though it may look a little weird. It evidently flew very nice. So 109 kind of dates back to the 108, and you look at the two things, they're completely different aircraft, but that's where Messerschmitt got his experience.
I think the undercarriage looks similar, and it was more or less the same thing, and the slats, of course. But after that, the 108 had way bigger wings. It had this huge cockpit where 4 people could fit in. The whole thing looked completely different.
And real quickly, there's this question that comes up all the time on the channel: is what do leading edge slats do? You want to explain, or shall I?
Well, you're probably better because you speak better English, but I'll pop in if it's required.
I'll try to put it in layman's terms as possible. Essentially, whenever the aircraft hits when X amount of air flows over the wing, the less amount of air that needs to sustain flight, the leading edge slat will pop out, make the wing area bigger, and then essentially creates more lift. That's kind of the layman's term version of it. I'm sure you can get much more technical than that, but that's kind of I call it the rookie or newbie thing of it. It's actually pretty ingenious. It's they used it on a bunch of other aircraft, and the Russians used it on the Lavochkins, and you'll see it everywhere. But I think it dates originally to German designs, and then the U.S. and so on. Kind of wherever you see it pop up, it was kind of stolen from there.
Yeah, the leading edge slats were quite a nice little touch to these aircraft. However, it must also be said that not every pilot was actually happy with them. Sometimes they would kind of open, asynchronously, or they wouldn't open at all, and that would then create problems, and sometimes they would even open when they weren't required, and of course suddenly you have one wing that has more wing surface than the other, and immediately the plane starts reacting depending on those forces. So they weren't 100% when you're working initially. Later on, I don't think you have those kind of complaints. But you still do see sometimes these complaints by Battle of Britain pilots flying 109s, the Emils, where they say that these leading edge slats, they were nice that you had them, but sometimes they just ruined your day because they didn't work like they were supposed to work.
From there, we're going to go on to... We're going to talk a lot about variants, and there's almost 100 109 variants in the end, if you combine them all together. So we're going to skip... We're going to talk about basically the big changes. We're not going to talk about every little version of the E or this or that, because it's just kind of... It'll take all day. We could probably do a 109 podcast on every, variant, per se.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are like 55 prototype variants already, so...
Yeah. So we're going to move on. We're going to talk about the first 10 pre-production aircraft that were sent to Spain. At this time, the Spanish Civil War was going on, and the German Air Force learned a lot from that experience. The first 10 in the English-written, U.S.-written 109 books always refers to those first 10 production aircraft for the most part as B-0s. I know that isn't quite technically correct. If you want to go on kind of the confusion of the B-0, the B-1, and the C, and I guess everything before C model is kind of a hazy on the designations.
So essentially, what was going on at this point is that the production, the prototype variants, which is always V in German, is always V. If you see any kind of German aircraft with a V behind it, it means Versuch, which essentially means prototype. We already talked about the V2, which was essentially the one that was in the comparison trial. The V3 was then the I'll call it vanilla version of the Anton. The first flight was in April 1936. It had a mechanical firing mechanism, 2 MG-17s. They also had a plan to have an MGC-30L, I believe the designation is. If you played War Thunder, you can see it in the Heinkel 112A0.
That'd be terrible.
It's essentially, it wasn't a very successful design. And they had so many problems with trying to get that cannon into the plane that they just said, okay, we won't do it. But the
cannon was essentially an anti-aircraft gun.
Yes.
That they tried to fit into an aircraft. So it's basically a full piece of artillery.
Yeah. So just think about one barrel of the Whirlwind. That's that was supposed to fit in the nose of that aircraft. I think they kind of got it working with the Heinkel 112, but it simply wasn't up to specs, and it created more problems than it actually made for the enemy. The very important thing about the V3 is that it already had quite a sophisticated radio. It had the Funkgerät 7, yes. Which essentially allowed you to have air-to-air and air-to-ground communication. The engine was also upgraded from the Jumoto 110A to the D, and this kind of carried on until the C and D versions. Although again, once we hit those aircraft, we have a little bit of haziness where some engines are installed here and some engines are installed there, and we'll get to that in due time. Anyway, the so-called BF-109A, there was a lot of pressure at this point, and they kind of had to be sent to Spain. Roughly 20 were built. I have numbers that say 20. I have other numbers that say 22. It doesn't matter. Roughly 20 were built and used by the Condor Legion. The designation Anton, this is where it gets a little bit strange. Officially, apparently, never used. All the production factory kind of papers, they always talk about the V3 being sent to Spain. However, the troops in the field were probably calling them Antons. It's probably something that was used colloquially between people. Officially, I don't really have anything that proves that Anton was already used at that point officially for this aircraft. After the war, it was probably just applied to this aircraft because it was the first aircraft that really saw service, and a prototype can't really see service. So with that mentality in mind, let's just call it the Anton. Like I said, 2 MG-17s. They were also this is where it gets a little bit strange. They were supposed to also carry bombs. And what was supposed to happen at this point is that behind the cockpit and behind the the kind of fuel tank that kind of sits there, there was supposed to be this vertical dropping mechanism for bombs, and kind of would pop open and it would drop 10 kilogram bombs at low altitude. The bombs weren't very sophisticated back then. They didn't have that, I think, electric detonation system. I don't know how to actually call that. I'm kind of a layman when it comes to bombs, but it didn't work. I think they tried it with one, and it didn't work. So essentially, it would have been a fighter that has kind of this capacity of acting like a horizontal bomber. Very silly, but
Yeah,
that's what they
it's
tried. And it didn't work out all too much. And they immediately recognized that this kind of idea just doesn't work. Then we move on to the V4, which essentially is the vanilla version of the Bertha, or the B version. And this is the first one where you can have that problem with B1, B0, B1, B2, and sometimes you even hear people saying B3. Uh, this is once again with this designation stuff, it gets really weird. B1 for sure was used by some people. B0 and B2 and B3 apparently, as far as I can tell from all the sources that I have, kind of attributed to these aircrafts post-war, because or the V4 or the B1 was continuously improved with very little things, and each time there was a little bit of an improvement. After the war, people said, okay, now it's no more a B1, now it's a B2. Okay, now it's no B2 anymore, now it's a B3. But as far as I know, the only real unofficial term that was used at the time was B1. This one had 3 MG17s. You can also have this aircraft in War Thunder, by the way. One firing through the engine with 600 rounds. This didn't work. Again, the Germans in the beginning, they had severe problems trying to get any weapon to fire through the propeller hub. So the engine machine gun was actually uninstalled due to these kind of problems. And then you have 2 machine gun 17s, and that's the aircraft you have in War Thunder. This weaponry was deemed extremely inadequate. You have to remember that this time the Republicans in Spain are using Russian I-16s, which already have 4 machine guns, and the Brits already have their Hurricanes. So compared with those aircraft, the Bf-109s are woefully underpowered in terms of armament. And this is where the idea comes in that you can maybe install additional weapons into the wings. And that we will get back to that once we get to the V11, V12, and the emails and so forth.
well, one thing about the
So
109s facing like the I-16s and stuff in Spain, that's initially where the Germans learned how to energy fight that they used basically throughout the rest of the war. They learned, like I said, they were underarmed against everything they were facing, but they learned quickly that they could climb higher, climb faster, die faster, and if they energy fought, nothing could touch them. And so, kind of from
yeah.
that point forward, that was their doctrine.
Also, it's the same thing with the bombers. Initially, when the Germans sent bombers to Spain, nothing could actually catch these early Heinkels and Dorniers. But yeah, as you say, like the whole kind of groundwork of how the Luftwaffe was going to operate in the sky was laid here in Spain, with Bf-109s, even with the Heinkel 112s. Some Heinkel 112s also served in Spain, being used to experiment on tactics, on formation flight, and so on. And you can see the big difference, for example, that comes out of this, because the Germans were already flying in that famous four flight formation, where you have the lead, and to his right or to his left is his wingman, and then on the other side you have another rotte, which means a two aircraft flight. I don't know. Maybe you can put a picture in there, because I kind of explained that really weirdly. While the Brits at the time of the Battle of Britain were still flying in a 3-man formation. The Germans actually called that Idiotenreihe, which means a row of idiots. And then later on in the war, everybody kind of adopted this kind of German way of flying in formation and so on, because it just had way more flexibility, and both on the offense and on the defense.
109 officially entered German service in 1937. I believe that's the correct date. A lot of people,
Yeah,
there's a
I think, yeah,
misperception I want to talk about real quickly with the
yeah.
how basically everybody says, like, if you look back at it, we want to think that the 110s and 109s and all the stuff that Germany was doing was built under secret. And some people have shared some really funny stories with me of, like, basically British test pilots going to Messerschmitt's factory and flying the 109 and flying the 110 and being impressed and going back to England and reporting what he saw and flew. And they were, Germany was showing this stuff off to whoever would basically
Oh yeah.
want it, and there was no secret. These aircraft were not built in secret. They were showing off their wonderful inventions and showing the world, their military might. And it's kind of funny,
Absolutely.
like the British knew exactly what was coming across the channel several years later,
Yeah.
because some of them flew it. They had a lot of information from test pilots.
Well, the funny thing here is that the Bf 109 actually made its international debut, so to say, in 1937. Like everybody knew already something was up because of Spain, but at the fourth International Flight Convention in Zurich, this was July August 1937. The Bf 109s were shown off, and they kind of competed in a few races and competitions, and they flat out destroyed the competition. It must be said, however, that the Brits, for example, didn't show up. They didn't come. I mean, they did show up, but they didn't show up with their new planes like the Hurricanes or the Spitfires. But the Germans were there in full force. I think they brought 5 or 6 Bf 109s, and they were being a little bit well, sneaky, let's say, because the actual aircrafts that were being used were officially not as highly rated as they were in reality. The Germans, when with the speed race, which they won against a English pilot by the name of Gardner, this was the Bf 109 V7 that won it, and this aircraft had a Jumo 210G injection, which roughly 730 horsepower. This injection kind of stuff is very important later on when we, I guess, talk about the Battle of Britain. And at the same time, there were also a couple of competitions for various military aircraft, Class A, Class B, and Class C. I think Class A was just fighters, Class B was twin-engine planes, Class C was a couple of, formation of flight, kind of, how do you call the Staffel when, one plane makes a run, and then the next plane makes a run, then the next plane makes a run, and then you can kind of combine the result and you apply it to this team score. That
It's
kind
the
of
air
race.
race.
That was
Yeah.
Class C. Yeah, that was Class C. Class A was won by the Bf 109 V9 versus a Czech pilot. Class B was won by the Dornier 17, which had engines that were officially not as good as they were in reality. And Class C was once again won by the Bf 109s. And then the last competition was a climb and diving diving competition. Once again, a 109 won. However, it must be said that here the Germans kind of told the press that they were using a Daimler-Benz 600 engine with roughly 960 horsepower. What they were actually using is a Daimler-Benz 601 racing engine, which was specifically built for this, and they had 2 of these installed in the V13 and the V14. The V13 had a performance of 1,650 horsepower, and the V14 had 1,560 horsepower. So essentially, they were nearly double as good as they were officially, told to the racing officials, and so on and so forth. This did come at a price. For example, the V14 was flown by Generalmajor Ernst Udet, who was kind of in charge of the Luftwaffe as well. And his aircraft, on every single attempt that he made in the race, broke down. His engine just couldn't keep up. Excuse me. But the V13 did the race quite easily, and it's no surprise that this aircraft then also later broke the speed record set by an American, Howard Hughes, by 45 kilometers an hour, going 610 kilometers an hour. This was in 1937. Back with that speed race, I guess they kind of said that this was a racing engine, but with the International Flight Convention in Zurich, they never told anybody. They kind of said, we're below 1,000 horsepower, while they were considerably above that performance.
So for the sake of time, we're going to condense a little bit. The C and the D model
Yeah.
are they're important from a development standpoint, but not necessarily from a massively historic standpoint.
Yeah.
The big Go
Um,
ahead and talk. Well, I guess we'll talk about the big change with those. To my knowledge, is just the engine. But at this point in German production, the 109 kind of took a back seat to bombers. All focus was on bomber production for a while, so the C and D kind of fit into that time frame where they were on the back burner. So the plane was still in development, but the production numbers are particularly low for these.
yeah, the C1, for example, was only produced 58 times, and that's the total production number for the C1. It, however, as you said, Jumo 210G injection engine. And then we also have a planned C3, which was supposed to be built with the MGFs, but it was planned, never built. And then we have the D1 with the Jumo 210D. This was a carburetor, and 5 of those were sold to Switzerland, as far as I know. What is important here to know is that Caesar and Dora, which is C and D for the German aviation alphabet, this is the first time we officially have this designation C and D, and this kind of speaks for the fact that B and A, I talked about this earlier with people actually not using it officially, kind of was used unofficially. So otherwise they would have called these A or B. But yeah, there we go. That's the C and D. They weren't that important in terms of actually making an impact in terms of production numbers or being used specifically in any kind of engagements. I think some of them might have seen service in later on in Poland. They were certainly some of them retrofitted into Emils, which took a little bit of tweaking, especially to the engine. And yeah, anything that was up front with the engine. But yeah, they weren't kind of important, but they kind of it kind of became obvious that finally the Germans have an aircraft that they could potentially turn into a real military vehicle.
And with the Polish, they sent over, I think it was like E1s. I think was the best plane that was probably sent to Poland.
The Polish campaign also saw a couple of E3s.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Very little of them. This is something that we're not quite sure of. As far as I know, the production for the E3s only really started in late 1939 when the Poles were already defeated. But apparently there were a few E3s already being used in the Polish campaign, but mainly it was E1s, which has had, of course, 2 MG-17s firing through the propeller above the engine, and through MG-17s firing in from the wings. Overall, the Emil, which was based on the V15 Daimler-Benz 601A engine, roughly 1,100 horsepower, 3-blade variable pitch propeller, slightly longer due to the engine than the Caesar and Dora. Also, because of the engine and the added weight and so on, it became less stable. This is actually something that is noted by a lot of test pilots between the Caesar or even the earlier versions and anything that came before, essentially the Emil. That anything before was quite easy on the pilot. Anything afterwards became a little bit more challenging.
It's probably all due to the
Also-
weight from just becoming an operational
Yes.
warbird.
Absolutely. I mean, the engine was 40 centimeters longer. It was heavier. The whole water and oiling cooling system had to be changed completely. The fuselage had to be strengthened. There was additional petrol because the engine used more. So I think it was like 400 liters. And also, this is very important, the Germans had big problems with their MGFs at the beginning. When they did the initial tests with the MGFs, they actually had big tears and rivets kind of flying out of the wing area where these MGFs were installed. So it took them a lot of time to actually finally clear those weapons for service. With the E3, of course, we have the MGFs being placed into the B109 Emils with absolutely no problem. Those became the mainstream German fighters, 1940, 1941, 41. And yeah, those weapons were finally fit for service at that point.
And the E3 was primarily used in the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain. As infamously known, Battle of Britain, the E3 and the Spitfires showdown is like the stuff of World War II lore. I don't know. We could talk a bit about Battle of France. I think we should probably try and do a Battle of France podcast sometime because there's a lot
Yeah,
there.
the one important thing I might say about the Battle of France is before the Battle of France we have something called the Phony War, which is when Germany and France was at war with each other, and nothing really happened. The French were sitting behind the Maginot Line. The Germans didn't have an army able to attack France at this point because everything was over in Poland. But the injection engine that I talked about at this point, the Germans actually considered this a kind of injection technology from the engines to be, a state secret. They were guarding that thing closely. However, during the Phony War, one German pilot, sadly, for him, shamefully, landed on a French airfield. He kind of got lost. He saw an airfield. He thought it was his airfield, or a German airfield, and he landed there. The French captured him, and they captured his plane. And over the French, the Brits also got a look into the injection kind of technology and how it works for the Germans and how they can maybe kind of replicate this technology. They were, of course, already working on that themselves, but it kind of gave them an impression of how it works in the German engine. However, it still took them a little bit of time until they finally had that injection, figured out. But it's kind of noteworthy to see, during this time of the Phony War, this closely guarded state secret, which the Germans really didn't want to have falling into enemy hands, fell into their hands quite easily just by a simple, human mistake.
This fuel injection system was, I can't stress how important it was. Every other basically aircraft in the world, whenever you pulled a negative G turn or you dove, the air could not get to the carburetor, and then the engine kind of died out either for a few seconds or you could kill it altogether. That's why in War Thunder, when you take one of those early aircraft, what's a good example of when the early Spitfires, or Hurricanes,
Yeah,
whenever you
Spitfire.
dive and the engine cuts out, or if you go inverted for too long, the engine cuts out. That's what we're talking about. They had unpressurized carburetors versus fuel injection. The fuel injection was a massive combat advantage.
Yeah, and I mean, the standard kind of defensive maneuver of a German pilot in the Battle of Britain was a split S, because you knew, the Brits couldn't follow that maneuver without having their engine cut out. If they kind of would push the stick forward and try to catch him as he makes that split S, their engine would cut out. And they would have to go into this this rolling maneuver and then slowly dive after him, and that took time for them, and they could never really get on his six again. So the standard kind of defensive maneuver, if a B109 pilot found himself in trouble over the channel, was always a split S. So that was extremely important actually during this time.
So we've had a Battle Britain podcast in the past. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about this. If you want to reference that one, there's a lot more there. I think we did that last year with Firefly and Kobe. So the thing I always say, I've said this past a couple videos and it's always gotten me kind of in trouble, it's always been on the side I think the 109E3 was the better plane than the Spitfires it was facing. But I think people have a big misperception of how the Battle of Britain really went due to movies or whatever they read, or just kind of the history of, you always see the paintings of the Spitfire versus the 109. And in all reality, it probably wasn't really a fair fight. The British had the radar, which told the Spitfires exactly where the 109s were sitting, what altitude, basically 109s kind of flew into a trap almost every time they flew over that channel. But also you had the German leadership just really screwing over their fighter pilots.
Oh, yeah.
And one big thing that we have to note is the Hurricanes were just annihilating German bombers going across the channel. So to kind of ease the mind of the German bomber pilots, they told the 109s to fly within visual range, which lower altitude and you're slower and you're sitting right there even as a bigger target. So the fighters couldn't even operate in a, I guess you call it, efficient manner. They were sitting there as like psychological boost for the bomber pilots, but it was screwing over the 109 pilots.
Yeah, I mean the whole philosophy behind the German bomber design was based on a kind of psychological enforcement that everything is going to be all right. What happened with the bomber design is that you kind of try to cramp all your crew into this small little bubble inside the aircraft, where they could mutually reinforce themselves with their presence. The pilot knew, next to him was, his rear gunner, and in front of him was his front gunner, and they could talk to each other. They kind of had that. How should I say? They kind of had
Camaraderie.
they could always, yeah, they saw each other and they kind of took, courage from that. However, if you have a Hurricane, 8 machine guns, who make one good pass, everybody is dead. It's and this kind of idea, however, that you can kind of morale takes a big part of it, kind of reinforce this. The Bf-109s have to fly in formation with the bombers and lose the element of surprise. They cannot do any kind of screening flights, fly ahead of the formation, try to pick off Spitfires or Hurricanes coming in. All of that went out of the window. At one point, even Bf-109s were loaded up with bombs, and they were supposed to drop their bombs with the Heinkel 111s at the same time. So when the Heinkel 111s are, let's say, above London, they start dropping the bombs. The Bf-109s were supposed to drop the bombs at the same time. Absolutely idiotic. One single, whatever, 250 kilogram bomb is useless compared to the escort potential of the aircraft that drops that bomb. So all of that was just wasted by essentially leadership giving these kind of idiotic orders, which also were based on, I guess, morale, because Hitler didn't like the fact that the Brits had been able to bomb Berlin. I think the Brits launched one small raid on Berlin. It was small. It didn't really have a big impact. But Hitler got furious, incredibly angry, fuming with rage. And he kind of called Goering that the Air Force is incompetent. What are they doing, and so forth and so forth. And Goering, of course, being a very choleric person as well, kind of took it out on his pilots. And it kind of told him these orders that were now coming down from headquarters, that the radar stations are not going to be bombed anymore, airfields are not going to be bombed anymore, factories are not going to be bombed anymore. The only thing that is now a target are civilian, cities and dense populated areas. And before that, the RAF was on their back foot. RAF pilots themselves say this, that there was a moment in time when it looked so bad for them that they didn't know if they would capitulate the next day or a couple of days after that, because they just couldn't see out of the misery they were in, because there were daily raids on the airfields and daily raids on radar stations. The radar was essentially knocked out completely, and all that tactic changed with this kind of high command going a little bit haywire. And the Brits were able to rebuild their radar stations within a couple of days. Their airfields were rebuilt within a day or two. The factories got up and running again, and that was essentially the Battle of Britain lost for the Germans.
Yeah, I just want to say I don't think it was necessarily like the Spitfire beat the 109. I think it was more due to bad leadership on one side and better technology on the other. That's kind of how it always came down from whenever I read different stories about Britain.
Well, the one thing also that didn't help the Germans was, of course, the limited range of the Bf-109.
So is there any other late model E variants that come to mind from a technology standpoint or historical standpoint you want to mention before we move on to the F model and North Africa?
I would say the E4 perhaps. I mean, there are a couple of models like the E9, which was a recon plane with cameras strapped onto it and so on, but that's not really important in for this podcast now. The E4 is probably something that we should mention. It had a couple of improvements over the E3. The pilot had additional armor on his headrest, which kind of comforted him a little bit, protected him a bit less than it actually comforted him, but hey, it was there and it was appreciated. And it also had the MGFFMs, which were finally able to fire the mine shell. Actually, these cannons and also the ammo coming for these cannons always had a big, in massive letters, in massive German letters, saying Achtung MGFFM. And everybody knew, okay, this canister has mine shells, okay, this cannon fires mine shells, and you have to be specifically careful and make sure that it's running properly. But that the E4 is probably the one with that is mentionable. For the rest, there isn't really so much for the emails. They did have tropical versions, and roughly 3,000 were built. However, it's very hard to actually get accurate numbers for the Emils because they were so many times retrofitted, like an E1 became an E3 and then it became an E4 and so forth. So it's a little bit hard and hazy, and the German way of keeping records didn't really, well, things went a little bit crazy, and there is not 100% production number for these Emils.
So the F1 and F2, where did they kind of fit in historically?
Well, by 41, the Germans kind of realized that they need a new fighter. They were happy with the B409Es, but they kind of told themselves, to have they knew something was up from the Allies, and they knew the Allies wouldn't be sleeping, and they knew the Allies would bring out new aircraft. So they started looking into upgrading the E model, and to do this, they specifically addressed aerodynamics. For example, if you look at the Emil and then compare it to the Friedrich, you'll see, the most striking characteristic is probably the engine compartment. It is way more aerodynamic with the Friedrich. However, there are more subtle changes as well. Not just are these aerodynamic changes and this kind of slightly curved ends of the wings that came into play there, but also the horizontal stabilizer didn't anymore rest on these little spars. Those were taken away, and all of that was kind of made to improve the aerodynamics. And that as well, the DB601N engine was first fitted to the F1 and the F2. Overall, pilots were very pleased with the F1 and F2 from a performance standpoint. From a weapon standpoint, they didn't like it. The F1, I'm sure you guys have flown it at War
Yeah, I was
Thunder.
gonna say War Thunder pilots are unhappy with the armament as well. So
Yeah. The MGFF it does fire mine shells of the F1. If you tell a pilot, right, you had a plane with two MGFFs and two MG17s, and now we're taking one MGFF away, he's not going to be overly happy with that. Of course, yes, the weapon fires out of the propeller hood, where it does make aiming a little bit easier. However, you fire less at the enemy. There's less chance, essentially, to hit with something, unless you have very good aim. And the whole striking power of the weaponry was inadequate. Although pilots were saying, they're very pleased with the performance, but they don't like what they've done to the weaponry. And the F2 kind of tried to address this with having the MG151-15. This was a 15mm cannon, also available in War Thunder, this plane, by the way. But this cannon, from a kind of penetration standpoint, it wasn't bad. But from an actual high explosive standpoint, compared to the mine shell that the German pilots have used earlier, they found it severely lacking. There were a couple of pilots that were very, very vocal about this. Adolf Galland was probably one of the most, and he had a very special retrofitted F2. In fact, he had two very special retrofitted F2s. In one of them, the MG17s, which were 7.92mm caliber, were changed to MG131s, which is a 13mm caliber, and it kept the MG151-15 for the propeller hub. And the other one, you retained the MG17s, but the wings were fitted with two MGFF-Ms. And he himself said that this was, incredibly good, because he had now essentially three cannons, or two cannons, one heavy machine gun and two light machine guns in his aircraft, and this firepower was overwhelming to anything he had in his sights. However, he was essentially the only one that had this kind of conversion, and even though he had very promising results, nobody really took note of this. And from this time frame on, if we ever see weapons back in the wings for the Friedrichs or the Gustavs or the Kurfürst, it is always in form of these, very ugly gun pods, instead of having MGFFs fitted into the wing, which is aerodynamically more intelligent, let's say.
And then we kind of enter the F4, which I think is safe to say is probably the pinnacle of 109 technology, and that's probably the best aircraft that came out of the whole 109 series. Is right around that time of the F4.
Yeah, I mean, the F4 in 1941, a lot of pilots kind of say it was the zenith of the B109 design. Yes, future planes will have more performance, but as just a well-rounded, balanced aircraft that is easy to use, that fits exactly into the time frame where aerial tactics are concerned. At this point, energy fighting was still very viable. Later on in the war, that kind of changed the boom and zooming from essentially all nations. Even the Japanese at the end kind of understood what was going on and tried to change, or albeit too late. But the F4 at the time, the whole design philosophy around it was such a well-balanced aircraft that it was, it wasn't easy to fly. Certainly wasn't easy to fly. You did have to require some skill to actually do it, but most pilots were very, very pleased with this aircraft. The 20 millimeter cannon that it had firing the mine shells, again, some pilots said that's not enough. We want more firepower. But at this point, they kind of realized, okay, it's not going to happen. And the MG151-20, while it's better than the two MG1 FFs we had earlier, we would like to have more firepower, but it's an acceptable compromise, let's say.
So the stories, let's talk about a little bit about North Africa. I'm trying to think of a good story to tell, just basically paint a picture.
Well, the first Friedrichs that actually went to Africa, of course, there were tropical versions. That sand filter over the air intake is probably the most profound thing you can identify from that version. And they were actually rushed into service, as far as I know, the Friedrichs. Earlier, the P-40s had been introduced into the North African theater by the Allies, and the P-40 was in some ways superior to the Emils. At least the Germans thought so. It wasn't imbalanced. It was the P-40 didn't climb as much as well as the E3 or the E4. But it dove better. The armament was very comparable. But once the Emil ran out of its cannons, then the armament of the P-40 was much better. Of course, 2 light machine guns against 6 50 cals. What are you gonna do? So the Germans realized that at this point they're losing the edge in the air, and that things are starting to get equalized, and they kind of had to rush the F4 into service in Africa. And then you of course have JG-27 with Hans-Joachim Marseille and their stories, which are quite sad in some way and quite amazing in another.
Yeah, things went really well for them for X amount of time, and then after that point, there's like a certain point where they were like rock stars essentially, and then they just kind of everything that could happen did happen to them. It is very sad. Like Star of Africa, we can't talk about this forever, but there's some really noticeable pilots that are worth your time reading about Star of Africa.
Yeah, he was a in colorful language, he was a shit pilot at first. It was a wonder that actually he made his license to essentially be a pilot. And in the Battle of Britain, he didn't do too much. He had some victories, but nobody really liked him. He was sometimes regarded as to be a little bit of a loose cannon, who just doesn't have the skill to back up his kind of attitude. And later then he was transferred to JG-27 because of insubordination. I think he actually will listen to American jazz. That was the final straw. But his complete inability to fly in formation or to act as a wingman or anything like that was also a big factor in here.
Once he got to North Africa, then the legend started, then the fame started. He was basically great newspaper material for the Germans, and like I say, he was kind of just a early 1940s rock star to them until tragedy hit him and basically the rest of JG-27. But
his fighting. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like I said, a lot of success, but the big problem with JG-27 on the other squadrons is they had to follow Rommel. If Rommel was advancing or retreating, or if the North Africa Corps was moving forward or backwards, those guys had to move their airfield forwards or backwards. They never really had a home base. They're just constantly on the move, and then there was no really fresh pilots or fresh planes. Those guys were just basically grinding out hour after hour after hour flying. And it takes a toll on anybody, especially in those harsh conditions. sleeping in the hot desert every night with limited water, limited food, and limited parts.
Yeah, in some way, the African theater is easy on planes in the way that you can very easily make an airfield if you have the required equipment. Because, it's flat, you don't have to worry about trees. You just find a nice little patch that doesn't have too thin sand that, your wheels get stuck in, and you kind of make your airfield. But at the same time, the way the front line was progressing, the limited range of the BF-109s, coupled that with being completely outnumbered and essentially outgunned in the air, wasn't too good for the Germans at this point. And there's a lot of stories about these guys. I think didn't you make a podcast about the North African?
I mentioned it
You
in
already
our
talked about this at
P40
some point.
podcast a little bit about
Yes.
how essentially, basically 109s ruled that theater until the P40 and the Americans and British kind of just overflooded it with new pilots and numbers, and then it just kind of
Yes.
became a test of will of man. And yeah, the German pilots didn't
Yeah,
have a chance in the end there.
I mean, the German pilots, what must also be said here is they were always on the front line. I mean, I think you said it in that podcast, they were essentially sleeping in their graves. They literally made these holes that could be served as a grave in each airfield that they went to because they were relocating all the time. They didn't have time to put up their tents and so forth. They made these holes into the ground and they kind of slept in them right next to their machines. That's kind of their lifestyle at this point. At the same time, they don't have any kind of holiday. They can't go back behind the front lines by 200 kilometers and just chill there. Let's put it in that kind of terms. When Marseille actually went to Germany for to get his medal from the little thing corporal at
Little
top.
corporal.
The little corporal who was handing out iron crosses to everybody. He that was essentially probably one of the only times that JG-27 ever had somebody on holiday from their front. Meanwhile, you have the British and the American pilots. Excuse me, the British pilots. The Americans were there also some volunteers at this point?
Americans are coming in, I think, at the tail end of this
Yeah.
this point. But it was basically
Yeah.
we kept sending the British anything that was new. The British got immediately. So
Yeah.
British always had new machines coming in off the American factory lines.
And at the same time, the British pilots, they had Australian pilots probably as well in that theater. They they had 3 days at the front line. Then they were shuffled back to Alexandria or something. There they enjoyed 4 days of holiday, and then they were sent back to the front for 3 days. And with 4 days of holidays, they were constantly shuffling. They had that manpower to constantly shuffle their pilots and still have more people in the air than the Germans. And the Germans had none of that. So you had German pilots doing 2 to 3 missions a day, escorting this flight of Stukas, escorting those flight of Stukas, intercepting these kind of bombers, and it completely wrecked them as human beings. In fact, I think it's even in a higher call, where the one of the pilots says that the pilots that didn't use alcohol as a means to calm themselves down in that theater later on in the war had severe psychological problems. Like those German pilots were pretty much drunk on duty all the time, and they were sent all the alcohol that the theater could muster because it kind of had to keep them going and being constantly in that bandwidth of not being too drunk but always being in some way elevated in your mood. That's where they had to keep these guys. And at the same time, these guys did their duty, but at the same time, there was no chance. They were at some point they had to flee, and I think you also mentioned that in the P40 podcast. When they kind of put their mechanics into the BF-109s in the back and kind of flew off to Sicily.
Any closing thoughts that you want to put in before we move on to the G's and K's in a couple weeks? Is there? I know, like you said, there's a lot of information that we had to skip. So unfortunately, we're only trying to do this for about 45 minutes to an hour, and we could go on for probably 6 hours of just so much information.
Well, from now on, things are gonna go downstream. Essentially, we already, started seeing how things develop in North Africa. Overall, the aircraft design with the Friedrich, the F4, it kind of has its peak. What you got to remember at this point is that aerial warfare is changing, and you can only improve and update a certain aircraft design so much. So we're going to talk about how the Germans try to keep the Bf-109 competitive, why it was kept into service instead of going for more up-to-date models. In I guess the next podcast. There's one very interesting prototype I kind of want to mention, and that is the Bf-109 V21. This was actually a Bf-109 fitted with a radial engine. Yeah, it looks very similar to a Lavochkin. I mean the and even a little bit like the P-47. It's kind of a child between a P-47 and Lavochkin, and somehow there's also a little bit of genes of the Focke-Wulf 190 in there. I don't know how they come in there, but there you go. So kind of you take that triangle, and in the middle there's the Bf-109 V21. Very interesting aircraft. They actually had these experiments on the Bf-109 airframe, and that kind of shows you that they were looking at ways to kind of take the Bf-109 to the next level. But we'll talk about whatever happened after 41 essentially in the next podcast.
Thanks to all the guys who sent in replays for the early models. You'll see their footage throughout this. If you have any
Do we have B footage?
Yeah, we're going to need G and K footage, so if you want to send that to bohikeice@gmail.com, there's no spaces in that. That'll be in the comments below. Also, please take a moment and check out Bismarck's channel. I'll put that link below as well. And if you have any questions about what we said in this, or we didn't say in this, or what we're going to say in the G and K, feel free to ask. We'll try to address those either in the comments or in next week or in the next podcast.
Yes.
Until then, thanks for listening. And you have any other closing statement?
Big thumbs up. Well, big thumbs up for the guy who actually made the big B footage, because that was probably our problem child.
The 109B in that game, it's you either have the greatest time in the world, you kill 3 or 4 things, or you're slamming your head against your desk going, why? I've been there, yeah.
That's War Thunder, yeah.
All right.
Anyway, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Until next time.